Okay, let's have a look at game 11 this morning. So game 11 saw Anand kick off with c4, the English opening. After e5 we have a kind of reverse Sicilian variation. So knight c3, knight f6, and it's the four knights actually. It's officially known as the four knights variation of the English, but it's kind of a reverse Sicilian because in the Sicilian, white's aiming for d4 to open up this, the d-file pressure in exchange for black's flank pawn. Here you see the same sort of thing emerge. After knight f3, knight c6, well, we have the four knights out, hence the name of the variation. But after g3, which is kind of a reverse Sicilian dragon, black is now playing d5. So we have the exchange of the flank pawn for the centre pawn. So in exchange, black's going to have pressure on the d file, white's potentially going to have pressure on the c file. So after c takes d, knight takes d5, bishop g2, the black knight retreats to b6. Coincidentally, in the recent match in the North Circular League, my good friend Veselin was facing David Sands in this very variation. So this is quite a solid choice actually against the English opening, playing for a quick d5, winning the knight on b6. And in that game, Sands, he'd huddled his bishops actually, e7 and bishop e6 later, f6, and later they were on f7 and f8 later, guarding the king, and seemingly very solid, control of both the colour complexes. So it's an interesting choice. If you're playing against the English opening, this is an interesting system to consider. I think it's still very popular. There was a very nice win though in the London Classic last year with Magnus Carlsen beating Kramnik, and in that game I think Kramnik actually created a problem by having a knight on e8 at one stage later in the game. It was actually the same moves here, so a3 castles b4, but I think now it started to vary. Instead of d3, which was played in this game, I think Magnus had delayed his d-pawn advance. He had played rook b1, and the game continued something like rook b1, f6, d3, a5, b5, knight d4, and it was very interesting. Then this knight retreated. The position seemed to have a lot more tension from the opening, but there was a problem knight for black. In this game though, black's knights seemed perfectly okay. Topalov seemed to play it in a very solid manner. So d3, f6. So the purpose of this, you may wonder, well, why didn't white try and win a pawn here? Well, this is not very good for white at all. Knight d4, and already if knight d4, black's going to get strong pressure, resolving that pawn issue. If the knight is driven back, this is absolutely equal for black. Say like bishop d5 and then f5 later, and this would be terrible for white. Knight takes e5. If you haven't seen this trap, bishop b3, and where does the white queen go? This would be a disaster. So this is why b5 is not a problem in this position. So d3, and now b5 is more seriously on the cards. So that's why black now supports the e-pawn with f6. Now Anand played knight e4, so he's immediately trying to seize the bishop pair. In the light of the Alex Veselin game which I witnessed, maybe this is a good idea to blind the bishop pair, to remove the dark square bishop at least. But white is closing up his own semi-open c-file and use of c5, so it's a little bit controversial perhaps, this knight c5, it would seem. But it does mean potentially on the dark squares, black is a little bit weaker. Also potentially in theory, maybe white wants to play d4 later, but in this game it seems d4 was never really on the cards because black had adequate control of the d5 square and is always able to answer with e4 later. So like e4, f5 and knight d5 would seem cozy for black. But anyway, this is still an interesting idea, and this is probably on the beaten path. I don't really know this theory all that well, but black took on c5 and now knight d5. Instead of the c file, white has now got potential pressure on the b file, and maybe this bishop can coordinate, say, with a rook later on that b file and b7 and a diagonal in general. So maybe white still has a slight advantage. Bishop b2, now rook d8. So using that semi-open d-file pressure, queen c2, and now knight de7. So black has the flexibility with this move, maybe a rerouting maneuver to d4, or alternatively he's just vacating d5. It can be more flexibly used now with, say, bishop d5 if he wanted to, say, cover c6 later. Okay, so what are the problems for black? Well, the b file might be a problem. With this in mind, rook a b1 targets potentially b7. So white's playing a very positional game. In fact, there's an interesting little annoying move played now to dislodge the rook from b1. Simply bishop a2. Seems a bit, of a nuisance move. The rook moves. Now queen f7. So actually, maybe, positionally, this has achieved a great deal. Without that rook on b1 and white, playing bishop c3 later, there's no build-up now on b7. The bishop is covering that b1 square. And also, black is strengthening the grip on these dark squares. Sorry, dark squares? Light squares. Black's strengthening that grip. So how can white actually try and build up an advantage here? Well, first he plays bishop c3, so increasing the tactical vulnerability of that bishop on a2. At the moment, Topalov is not concerned. He just plays rook d7, as though he's simply going to maybe double up rooks, then play knight d4 at some point, which might strategically favour black to get a pawn there, because then this pawn will be under fire on this e file. That's a strategic consideration, how this pawn structure can transform maybe a bit more in black's favour if it became a bit more aggressive. Okay, so queen b2 though supports maybe d4 soon, but at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, black's always able to answer with e4 and f5 and has great control of d5 here. So this doesn't seem as though there's a guarantee an advantage. But also it does hit the b7 pawn. So what is black doing about that? Well, Topalov actually calmly plays rook b8. And then we see rook fd1, as though white really is more serious about playing d4. And it's here, actually, that Topalov decides to get that bishop out of there with bishop e6. d4 again, it's just adequately answered all the time with e4 it seems, and then f5 and then knight d5. So Anand just is content to play rook d2. I'm not sure he's achieved a great deal from this opening actually. He's got the dark squared bishop, but if black really wants the dark squared bishop, he can go for it now with knight d5. I think white would be losing it. But in fact, Topalov is not that bothered about the bishop here. He just plays h6. And maybe his idea here is to more freely be able to play f5 without relying knight g5s. This is if, for example, d4, e4 and then f5. Okay, so queen b1. What does this move do, you might ask? Well, maybe it prepares rook b2, trying to intensify the pressure on the b file. Okay, knight d5 now. It also actually did vacate now this diagonal, so the bishop can retreat now if white wanted to maintain the dark square bishop. But Anand is now not bothered about that. He just plays rook b2 to content to have a little bit of b file pressure. Doesn't mind this exchange, but Topalov is not going for that. He just plays b6, so he's trying to just neutralise the file pressure as the top priority. So cb, cb, bishop d2. Okay, maintaining the dark square bishop, hitting c6. How does black defend c6? Seems a rather awkward defensive move now, rook d6, because white's rooks are more comfortably sort of positioned, just, doubling up the pressure on the c file now after rook bc2. So perhaps you could argue, well, white's achieved a success from the opening, a small advantage, avoiding theory, and in particular, you don't want to get into preparation, into Topalov's preparation. So maybe it's done its job. Anand is content with trying for a small but lasting advantage. So queen d7 supports c6, but maybe also if this knight moves or is protected later, maybe bishop h3 might be considered. A lot of attacking players might like that plan, but here I don't know, because black is weak on these light squares, so positionally this is suspect to get rid of this bishop for this bishop anyway. So maybe that's not a serious intention ever to play bishop h3 in this line.